What in God's name is freaking vegan?
You only eat vegetables that have been thrown out in people's dumpsters.
The food that we're used to today is nothing like what they used to eat hundreds of years ago. So let's look at 10 things medieval peasants actually ate. Butter.
I still can't believe it's not butter.
These days, butter is actually not as common as margarine, which is a butter alternative made from vegetable oils instead of heavy cream, and is supposed to be healthier to eat than traditional butter. And while we have options such as margarine made of olive oil, margarine with omega-3 added, or even salt-free margarine, back in the medieval days, their only option was plain old butter.
It is what it is.
It was a cheap and widely available option for many that helped stave off malnutrition, and it helped that it tasted good as well. Butter was extremely common, and since they had no refrigeration back then, it was often stored in holes in the ground. In fact, ancient butter stores have been uncovered, and its staple product has been determined to still be safe to eat, if someone really wanted to try very old butter. Butter was all hand-churned back then, which took a lot of work, but was worth the effort to get the much-needed fat and other nutrients that medieval peasants relied heavily on to keep themselves from going hungry. Butter back then was not quite used the same as we use it today. Back then, it was eaten in thicker portions as an actual food item, rather than just as an addition to food items. Bread.
You like bread? Yeah. Have some.
It should come as no surprise that bread was an important staple food in the medieval era, with rye bread being the most popular among the lower classes due to the fact that the ingredients were cheaper to acquire. This bread was not quite the same as what we're used to eating today. In fact, this cheap version of bread was harder and more cake-like than the soft, fluffy bread we eat today. Bread was a staple in the diet of many people during this time, being filling enough to keep people from going hungry. For the most part, peasants tended to just eat bread on its own, or eat bread and cheese at the same time. It's hard to imagine plain bread as a meal, but with how cheap and readily available bread and bread ingredients were, it was a great option for those who did not have a lot of money to afford other things for their meals.
Not bad. Not bad.
Bread could also be used to dip in soups in order to make it a little less dry to eat. Most commonly, it was eaten by peasants who worked hard labor jobs because it was easy to bring with them and filling enough to keep them going for the day. Fish.
Fish for sport only, not for meat. Fish meat is practically a vegetable.
Fish was more readily available for peasants who lived near water sources than other meats were. The upper classes preferred game meat and poultry over fish, so for the most part, landowners would allow peasants to fish all they wanted for free. For the most part, medieval peasants consumed a large majority of their protein from fish meat, as other meats needed to be hunted and were often very expensive to actually purchase for themselves.
Sorry, you guys, but I can't pay that. It's too much money.
For those who did not have a lot of income to spare, free fish was a way for them to feed themselves and their families at times when they may not have had money to put any other food on the table. While fish that was sold at market was actually fairly expensive, the peasant population would have access to fishing waters to get their own fish, rather than having to spend what little money they may have had on fish at the markets. Fish could also be salted, which would allow it to be kept for longer over the winter months or for the times when food was more scarce. Eaten on its own with some flavoring or cut up and added to soups and stews, no matter how it was made, fish was a staple part of the diet of peasants who lived close enough to the water to be able to fish for themselves without spending any money. New to our channel? Then make our day and hit that subscribe button. Thanks. Now back to medieval times. Candied fruits.
Why is there fruit? What is fruit?
Sweet treats were not only reserved for those who were in the upper classes. While both upper and lower classes did have different sweet items that were available to them based on cost and availability, one thing that they could both agree on was the fact that candied fruit was delicious.
Yours is a sweet tooth.
Made from whatever local fruits were available, the fruits were candied by cutting them into pieces, soaking them in water for a few days, and then covering them with honey and boiling them for a while. While there were a few more steps to creating candied fruits, those were the basics of how they were made. Honey was cheap, and fruit was often cheap or free if you could find it out in nature rather than in the market, meaning that candied fruit could be enjoyed by everyone. The fruit was a healthy part of the peasants' diet, and the honey was a great way to sweeten sweeten the fruit and change the flavor. However, candied fruits were not available year-round due to the fact that the winter months would see the fruit trees bare and the honey production stopped by the dormant bees. When candied fruits could be enjoyed, though, they were a great way to add sweetness and some flavor to the medieval diet.
Nothing better.
And also some much-needed vitamins and nutrients that would help keep them as healthy as a person could be in these times. Carrots.
Ingredients. Carrot. Gotta respect that.
Carrots were a popular food among the peasants of medieval times due to the fact that they could easily be grown almost anywhere, whether on small plots of land around their houses or just small handmade gardens near the sides of their dwellings.
Easy peasy.
Carrots did not take up much space in the gardens, and therefore you could grow more of them in limited space and provide more food by doing so. The carrots were chopped up and included in stews and soups with other easy-to-obtain ingredients, often other vegetables that could be grown in the same plots of earth. They provided vitamins and nutrients that were essential to keeping the peasants fed and able to work. And if they had access to carrots, they could trade them with friends and neighbors for other things that they may have needed. Carrots were never eaten raw in any way, as people at this time thought that raw fruits and vegetables were bad and would cause you to get sick. Interestingly enough, when medieval peasants were sick, they were allotted an extra amount of vegetables in order to help them get better. While they may not have known why vegetables were good for them, they were at least on the right track. Cheese.
I hate it this way.
What's wrong with it?
Less cheese.
Dairy products were popular among medieval peasants as they could sometimes raise cows to harvest milk from, or if they were unable to raise a cow of their own, they would often know someone or somewhere that they could obtain milk or cheese for a cheap price. If a peasant could get their hands on a cow of their own, they would have a great source of free food. They would also be able to sell or trade any extra milk and cheese produced after feeding themselves and their families.
Easy money, right?
Cheese would often be eaten in combination with bread for lunch, oftentimes eaten by peasants who worked manual labor, as it could easily be carried to work and provided the feeling of fullness that was required to keep them working all day without passing out. Cheese back then was softer and not quite as tasty as we're used to now, with there not really being any different kinds of flavors or varieties. Cheese was mostly just used as a source of quick nutrients and a way to feel full for cheap.
I said I hate being poor.
Though cheese was very popular with peasants, it was also eaten by the upper class as well, though it was usually used as part of a dish rather than just eaten plain with bread or by itself. Cheese was a cheap and efficient way for peasants to feed themselves so that they could spend their days working or foraging for other food. Mushrooms.
An entire case of mushroom soup for $4.99? Damn it, Costco, you've done it again.
Mushrooms were a good source of food for peasants that could not afford much else or did not have the option of growing their own food, as they could go out into the forests and forage for them at no cost. Mushrooms were mainly used in soups and stews, along with other vegetables, though they were not quite as full of good nutrients and vitamins as other vegetables were. An issue with foraging for mushrooms to eat was the fact that not every peasant was good at identifying the different types of mushrooms.
That sounds bad.
It is bad.
Meaning that they may have picked and eaten a mushroom or two that was not exactly good for them. Through trial and error, it was eventually learned which mushrooms were edible and which were not, though it would have been easy enough to make a mistake. Those types of mistakes were the types of mistakes that could cause illness or even death, depending on the mushroom and its side effects. While the majority of peasants were used to foraging for their own food and would be more careful with mushrooms to make sure that they picked the right ones, they were not the ideal food if there were other options out there, though there were not always other options for those who did not have a lot of money or other resources. Pork.
My name's Percy. Would you like some pork?
Pigs were a common source of meat for peasants as they were easier to take care of than cows were. Pigs could be fenced into a forested area and left to fend for themselves while being able to survive just fine, whereas cows required care and feeding and could not take care of themselves like pigs. For this reason, the most common meat that peasants would have been able to eat, aside from fish, would have been pork, including bacon.
Give me all the bacon and eggs you have.
This pork would often be salted to preserve it for as long as possible, and also included in stews whenever they had it on hand. The fat was also used either to eat for extra calories or to fry other foods in. The pork cuts would be salted so it could be kept over the winter, meaning when food was harder to find because foraging was near impossible, they would still have something to eat. Basically, every part of the pig was used to make food, as peasants could not afford to waste anything. Even their hooves were jellied and made edible.
It's for the best.
Though pigs were inexpensive to keep when compared to other animals raised for meat, there were still plenty of peasants who could not afford them. Kale.
Kale is a garnish. It's not ready to anchor a meal.
Kale was another vegetable that was easy and free for medieval peasants to grow. It made up a fairly decent part of their day-to-day diets and was one of the healthier things that they were actually able to eat. In fact, kale was the most eaten vegetable in medieval diets for quite a few years, usually boiled and included in their soups and stews, as were most of the vegetables that were eaten at the time. Kale played a key part in keeping peasants as healthy as they could be at the time, being nutrient-rich and full of essential vitamins that are needed to keep people alive and well. Sometimes kale was also boiled in salt water with some added oil and served with bacon and mustard. Another option for kale would be to boil it and serve it with cooked eggs on top of it. While these recipes may sound like a strange dish to eat these days, it would have been a typical peasant meal back in the medieval times. They had to make do with what was available to them, and a lot of the time it was mainly vegetables that they had easy access to.
Again and again and again.
Kale could not only be grown by peasants, but also could be foraged in the wild if growing was not an option. Eggs.
Where's my soft-boiled egg?
I scrambled it.
Not every peasant in the medieval ages could afford to keep birds, such as chickens, but there were a few that could. Those who did not have a bird of their own could forage for wild bird eggs out in the forests to add to the food that they needed in order to survive. Eggs could be used in baking or in cooked dishes, or could simply be boiled or fried and eaten on their own. Eggs were used widely in baking, though that was mostly in the case of the upper class who could afford to bake things other than basic bread. Chickens were worth owning if a peasant could afford them because they would produce eggs year-round to consume, and when they were no longer useful for eggs, the chickens could be used for meat. Poultry was a rarer option for most peasants, so being able to have it when their egg-laying chickens were no longer laying eggs was sort of a special treat.
Got any fried chicken?
Best damn chicken in the state.
Egg-laying chickens can lay 80 or more eggs a year if they're well taken care of and healthy, which means they are perfect for producing a good amount of eggs throughout the year. If they had more than one chicken, they may even be able to get an egg or two every day.
Nice.
We've got more. Just tap or click on another video. First time here? Then hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell.